When Americans think of World War II, their minds travel outward, to Normandy's beaches, to the Pacific's island campaigns, to the skies over Europe, filled with bombers and anti-aircraft fire. The war, in collective memory, feels distant and explosive. It feels like something that happened somewhere else. But in 1943, the war quietly crossed an ocean and arrived in places no one expected. It arrived not with bombs, but with trains, not with gunfire, but with guarded silence. And it settled into wheat fields, cotton farms, and rural communities across the United States. By mid-1943, America faced a growing crisis at home. Millions of American men were deployed overseas. The Selective Service had pulled farmers, factory workers, mechanics, and sons from small towns across the Midwest and South. Crops still needed harvesting. Livestock still needed tending. Food production was essential not only for American civilians, but for Allied forces abroad. The United States was fighting a global war, and it needed to feed it. At the same time, something unexpected was happening thousands of miles away on foreign battlefields. American forces, along with British and Allied troops, were capturing large numbers of German soldiers in North Africa and later in Europe. The question quickly emerged: where would these prisoners go? The answer was surprising. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States transported approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war to American soil. It was one of the largest POW relocation operations in history. Over 700 camps were established across the country, from Texas to Nebraska, from Alabama to Idaho. Some were large base camps. Others were smaller branch facilities located near farms, timber operations, and agricultural hubs. The decision was strategic. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war could be used for non-military labor, provided they were treated humanely and not forced into combat-related production. Agriculture was permitted, and America needed workers. When the first groups of German POWs arrived by ship in East Coast ports, they were transported inland by rail. They stepped off trains in small towns whose residents had never imagined they would host enemy soldiers. There were no parades, no welcoming committees, just guarded formations, military police, and uneasy stares. Local newspapers documented the tension. Headlines reassured citizens that security was tight. Editorials debated whether housing enemy soldiers on American soil was wise. Church leaders spoke about morality, justice, and caution. In many towns, fear was quiet but present. These were men who had worn the uniform of a nation at war with the United States. Some Americans had sons fighting in Europe at that very moment. And yet, by federal order and international law, these prisoners would live and work within American communities. Life inside the camps was regulated. POWs were housed in barracks, fed rations comparable to U.S. troops, and paid modest wages for their labor, often 80 cents per day, credited to accounts within camp systems. They could purchase small items at camp canteens. They were allowed to receive mail. Red Cross inspections monitored conditions. The United States government understood something important. The treatment of German prisoners would influence how American POWs were treated abroad. Humanity, in this case, was also strategic. But the real transformation did not happen inside the camps. It happened in the fields. In states like Kansas, Texas, Arkansas, and Minnesota, farms were struggling. With able-bodied men overseas, agricultural output risked decline. The War Food Administration pushed for solutions. German POW labor became that solution. Under guard, prisoners were transported daily from camps to farms and returned at night. They harvested wheat, they picked cotton, they cut sugar beets, they repaired fences and machinery. They helped save harvest seasons that might otherwise have failed, and in doing so, something unexpected began to unfold. In one documented case from rural Nebraska, preserved in county archives and later studied by historians, a farmer whose two sons were serving in Europe reluctantly agreed to accept POW labor. He had resisted initially. Pride and anger made the decision difficult, but crops do not wait for pride. The first day was tense. The prisoners avoided eye contact. The farmer gave short instructions. Guards watched carefully. Work began. The rhythm of agriculture is universal. Soil must be turned. Grain must be cut. Weather cannot be negotiated. As days passed, routine replaced tension. One afternoon, according to oral histories recorded decades later, a combine malfunctioned during harvest. Repairs would normally take hours. One of the prisoners, a former mechanic before the war, gestured toward the machine. Under supervision, he was allowed to inspect it. Using limited tools, he improvised a fix that allowed the harvest to continue that very day. No one applauded. No friendship was declared. But something shifted. The enemy now had a skill, a history, a face. Across America, similar patterns emerged. Archival letters reveal farmers acknowledging that many POAs were disciplined and efficient workers. Some were educated. Some spoke limited English. A few had lived in the United States before the war. Suspicion did not vanish overnight. There were escape attempts, though most were brief and often half-hearted. Germany was an ocean away. The majority of prisoners did not attempt serious flight. Records show that violent incidents were rare. In fact, many communities reported fewer disciplinary problems among POW laborers than among some civilian labor groups. Still, moral tension remained. Town meetings debated whether employing prisoners was ethical. Some residents believed it softened the reality of war. Others argued it was both legal and necessary. For farmers, the equation was practical. Without labor, crops would rot. Without crops, food supplies would shrink. Without food, the war effort would suffer. So day after day, German POWs worked American soil. And in that daily proximity, humanity crept into spaces ideology once occupied. Farmers began to observe differences among prisoners. Some were young conscripts, barely out of adolescence. Others were older, reservists. A few were committed Nazis, though camp systems attempted to isolate the most ideologically extreme individuals from general populations. Many were simply soldiers caught in a war beyond their control. Letters preserved in the National Archives showed that some American farmers began to treat POW workers with restrained respect, not friendship, but fairness. Water breaks were shared. Tools were handed over without hostility. Occasional brief conversations occurred under supervision. After the war, several former prisoners wrote letters back to American families who had treated them decently. Some expressed gratitude. Some described their time in captivity as the first moment they began questioning Nazi propaganda about Americans. Historians estimate that thousands of former German POAs later immigrated legally to the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, citing humane treatment during captivity as a major reason. In Texas alone, over 78,000 German POAs had been housed during the war. Agricultural output in certain counties would likely have declined sharply without their labor. And yet, despite this measurable impact, this chapter of history remains largely absent from mainstream narratives. Perhaps because it complicates the simplicity of us versus them. The war ended in 1945. Germany surrendered. Camps began gradual closure. Prisoners were repatriated over the following year. Trains that once delivered guarded men to rural towns now carried them toward ports for return across the Atlantic. On American farms, sons came home, but not everything returned to what it had been. In some towns, memories lingered quietly. Old residents remembered the German boys who worked during harvest seasons. Some remembered kindness, others remembered tension. The farmer in Nebraska never publicly spoke about those years. He did not consider himself heroic. He did not consider the prisoners friends. He considered it survival. He fed his community. He obeyed the law. He navigated moral complexity without cameras or headlines. And perhaps that is what makes this story powerful. Not dramatic heroism, not cinematic confrontation, but restrained humanity under pressure. In a time when hatred could have ruled unchecked, many Americans followed the rule of law. They treated prisoners according to international standards. They allowed labor where permitted. They kept discipline without descending into cruelty. It was not sentimental, it was structured, and it revealed something about America during one of its most defining conflicts. War is often remembered through explosions, but sometimes it is defined by restraint. The fields of Kansas, Texas, and Nebraska do not carry monuments to this chapter. There are no statues honoring agricultural cooperation between enemies. But the archives remember. The letters remember. The harvest records remember. And in the quiet documentation of wartime America, one truth stands clear. The war did not only test America's military strength, it tested its character. And in fields far from the front lines, ordinary citizens faced a choice to respond to fear with cruelty, or to respond to necessity with discipline. They chose discipline. They chose structure. And in doing so, they shaped a lesser-known story of World War II, one not written in battlefields, but in wheat fields. This is not a story of friendship conquering war. It is a story of law prevailing over emotion, of farmers feeding a nation, of prisoners surviving captivity, of a country proving that even in global conflict, humanity did not have to disappear. History rarely pauses for these stories, but perhaps it should, because they remind us that the strength of a nation is not measured only by how it fights, but by how it behaves when it holds power over its enemy. And in the quiet fields of wartime America, that strength was tested, and, quietly, it endured.